Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to SF Commons. Tonight we have Sandhya Anantharaman to talk to us about basic income. The concept itself has been around since the 1700s, and some states, including Hawaii, Alaska, have benefited from the basic income, but it hasn't really reached the mainstream media consciousness as far as we can tell. So tonight we're bringing in Ananya to talk about what this concept is about. She's the co-director of the Universal Income Project. She has been involved in progressive politics, working on national campaigns like President Obama's campaign. She was originally from Atlanta, Georgia. Welcome. Sandhya, how are you doing tonight? Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Right. I went to your conference and it was very impressive, the CASH conference.
Yeah.
A friend invited me to that. I've never heard of it before. I've never seen it before. And I thought, wow, this is awesome. So please tell us about the basic premise.
So I'm so excited to be here, and I'm really glad that you enjoyed CASH Conference. Essentially, basic income is a federal program designed to provide Americans with financial and economic security. So it's a simple program in its inception. Essentially, under a basic income, all Americans every month would receive a check in the mail, enough to cover their basic needs. So this is really a way of providing all Americans with an income floor, with financial security, with the assurance they'll be able to put clothes on their back and food on the table. And when you think about the impetus for this program, as you mentioned, this program has been in American dialogue for the last 50 years. In the 1960s, we were talking about this program.
Right.
But when you think about the state of our economics today, we are living in a time of unprecedented economic anxiety. Median household incomes now are lower than they were in 2002. So families are making less money than they did 15 years ago. And, the shocking statistic from the Federal Reserve, over half of Americans can't afford a $400 emergency expense. So if these families were to have to pay $400 out of pocket, they wouldn't be able to without taking out a loan from friends or family. I mean, this kind of insecurity is bad for our economy, and it's bad for our society. So what we need to do is fundamentally rethink the way that Americans are able to achieve this kind of financial security. And the simplest way to do that is to take the enormous wealth that we've accumulated and make sure everyone can meet their basic needs.
Exactly. You're talking about income inequality, and I think that in the last elections, Bernie Sanders has brought this issue to the forefront of the American consciousness. A lot of people know personally that they're just hard up, that they're not meeting basic economic needs, right? You have people who are like in their 50s, maybe even working 2 to 3 jobs just to pay the rent. That's pretty sad. If you make $14, $15 an hour, and San Francisco rents are like $2,500 for a studio, you're just not gonna eat. So this basic concept is quite fascinating. You have Stockton. I watch mayor, young mayor from Stockton, Michael
27
Tubbs.
years old.
Impressive, quite impressive. He carried himself really well,
I know,
smart.
right?
Oh my God. And he's so down to earth, He was talking about his mayoralty and the Seed Project.
When it comes to the best way to make sure that people can support themselves, just giving them the cash to meet their basic needs works. We have the research to show that, but what we need are the stories, and that's what Stockton is really about. What happens to these families? Stockton is an interesting community because commuting from Stockton to San Francisco to the East Bay to get jobs. And so, as you mentioned, this kind of fracturing of work that we've seen over the last couple of decades, people working multiple jobs, none of the jobs paying enough.
Right.
How does giving people a baseline that they can count on?
Right. 1 in 4 people in Stockton live in the poverty level, right? And so they're getting, with the SEED program, every person gets $500 a month. And then the funds came from a bunch of different folks, researchers and so forth. With the basic income concept, where exactly is the money is going to come from?
Well, one thing you mentioned before that I want to circle back to is the Alaska Permanent Fund.
Right.
Which I think is a really interesting example of a basic income type program that actually already exists in the U.S. So the Alaska Permanent Fund was a program that was established in the 1970s.
Wow.
Essentially, the government got tens of millions of dollars in oil revenues.
Right.
And so what they decided to do was invest that money.
Right.
So now every Alaskan every year gets half of the interest, gets a portion of that interest that's accrued from this fund that they created. So they take the interest accrued and they divide it up, and every Alaskan gets a check at the end of every year, something like between $1,000 and $1,000 and $2,500 a year. And so, you know, that money came from taxes that were being paid by oil companies. And we can think about similar sources of revenue for things like carbon taxes, right? So there's a lot of questions about what are the things that belong to all of us that we can return to Americans as dividends. But then other sources of revenue, I mean, we've quadrupled our GDP over the last 40 years. But the vast majority of Americans aren't sharing in that wealth that we've created anymore. So I think there's there's no question that we're an unbelievably wealthy country.
Yeah, it's just a question of where the money goes to, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, right. Now, in the conference, you have a lot of movers and shakers in there. You have one of the former founders of Facebook and people from the technology field. What is their interest?
Yeah, I mean, Chris Hughes is one of the co-founders of Facebook, and he is one of the co-chairs of Economic Security Project, which is essentially a funding mechanism for the basic income advocacy space. And so, you know, I think that basic income has really seen this renaissance in interest over the last couple of years. And it's because we're having this conversation about automation. So how is automation going to change the way that work looks? But I think the real question is, how has it already changed, you know, the way that Americans are able to take care of themselves? So I think that's why technologists are interested in this conversation, because we're all starting to see how economically insecure we are, right? And so we are trying to think about what happens in 20 years? How do we ensure that people have the flexibility and the security to be able to work jobs, but also just to be able to take care of themselves? Right.
Now let's take California. California is what, the sixth largest economy in the world? It ranges from 6 to 8, with a huge income stream, but also a lot of expenses. How would basic income work in California? Do you have to go to the legislature to enact a legislation? Do they have to identify the source? How would, give us an example
of how do we make sure that in California we're taking care of everyone and everyone's able to share in our incredible prosperity is a critical question. You know, I think that ultimately a fully funded basic income is going to be a federal program. But that being said, I think that what we need to do in California is take a look at what kind of dividend programs we can create here. So, you know, if you remember the climate, you know, control, the carbon tax and bill that was passed this year, there was actually a version that was proposed earlier in the year that would have taken some of the revenues from carbon taxes and distributed it to Californians as a dividend. And so I think we need to look at sources of funding like that to create dividend programs for all Californians. I really think that's the next step that we should be taking in order to make sure that we're giving Californians the opportunity to take care of themselves.
Yeah, the irony of it is now the governor and the legislature passed the gas tax, which is kind of the opposite of what you're talking about. I mean, but I think.
Well, I mean, it's a great point. What we need to do in California is have a conversation about work. Right? So for a long time now, our social contract in the U.S. has sort of relied on companies, on job security, not only wages, but also saving for retirement, healthcare benefits, Everything has been tied to a job. But now the number of people, you know, the model back then was you graduate college or you don't go to college, you get a full-time job, you work your way up, and you basically stay at the same company for 30, 40 years. That company pays you a pension, you retire, you're good to go.
Right.
You know, jobs today don't look anything like that. And it's time that we totally rethink this social contract, right? What we need to do, you know, it's like I said before, it's not good for our economy or our society when so many people are anxious.
Right.
What we need to do is remove that anxiety, create a floor, so that no matter what type of work people are doing, you know, we're including things like caregiving here, like parenting, that are full-time jobs that we're not compensating. What we need to do is create a floor so that people can, you know, instead of trying to say, oh, here, go back to school so you can get retrained, here, like, you know, we'll give you unemployment insurance for a year so you can try to find a job. We're making it impossible for people to try to, you know, navigate the economy today.
Right, exactly.
So that's what we really need to rethink. And you know, in California, what I think we need to do is have a conversation about whether work is the only thing that makes you deserving of being able to meet your basic needs. Because that's the assumption we're making today, right? We need to say, look, people should be able to meet their basic needs no matter what. And we can afford to do that.
Well, remember the time when, I don't know if you remember this, but in San Francisco, homeless people get cash?
Yeah.
And Gavin Newsom,
it was care not, he changed that. He severely
says,
limited
care
it.
not cash.
Exactly.
Well, so now the homeless do not have cash and they do not have care. The waiting list is like 6,000 at least of people in the homeless list, and a lot of them are families. So that's quite the opposite of what you're talking about, I would think.
Yeah, you know, with the way that our social safety net works today, in a lot of ways we're trying to guess what people need, right, and then provide it for them. So we say, okay, you need food. Okay, so we'll provide you with food stamps, but here's limitations on what you can and can't buy. We think that you need to be able to find a place to live. Makes sense. So we'll provide you a housing voucher, but only in these areas and only for this kind of construction. And the problem is that this safety net isn't flexible enough to adapt to the needs that people actually have, right? So let's say you're able to have enough money for food and shelter, but these programs aren't covering childcare. They're not covering the cost of transportation because you can't afford to live in Oakland anymore. So you moved out, you know, deep into the East Bay, and now you're commuting into the city, right? Like, we need programs that let people decide for themselves what the most pressing need at that point of time is, right? Because you have folks who at the end of the month aren't able to pay for food because they need to make sure they're saving money for rent, but their food stamps also don't come in until the beginning of the month. Our system is just not flexible enough at this point in time. So what a basic income could do is essentially serve as a foundation for our social safety net, as a backbone, right? So at the minimum, people are getting this amount of money to, you know, make sure they're covering food, clothes on their back. And then on top of that, we can make sure that people have adequate access to healthcare, that they have, you know, we're updating housing so that they can make sure that they have a place to live, right? But fundamentally, if you don't have enough money to put food on the table, then all of this other stuff becomes a lot more complicated to solve.
You mentioned that it would most probably be through federal legislation that this basic income mechanism could be instituted. Exactly how would that work then with the federal government? Congress would have to pass a legislation and put that in, make the appropriations in the budget?
Yeah. I mean, I think that you mentioned states like Hawaii. I think what we're going to see here is a lot of different states exploring this conversation in different ways, right? So Hawaii recently passed a bill where the state legislature committed to ensuring financial security for all Hawaiians. They said this is a priority for our government. We believe that financial security is a right for Hawaiian families. And so they've created this incredible sort of cross-partisan commission, union leaders, business leaders, Republicans, Democrats, all coming together to explore the future of work and how to implement policies like basic income to ensure that the transition, you know, as our economy is transitioning, we're making sure people have enough to meet their basic needs. So we're seeing movement like that in Hawaii. We're seeing conversations about the earned income tax credit, expanding programs like that, conversations about dividends like in Alaska. So I think we're going to see a lot of exploration in different states, a lot of conversations about this question of dignity and how to make sure that that's what we're ensuring for Americans.
You know, I think that if you look at it from a business model, it makes better sense, because if you give people the cash and you've already sorted out how much you require to meet the basic needs, then you cut out the administrative expenses.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I think
instead of the government, every time the government runs something, it's 4 or 5 times the actual cost. Whereas if you give it to the people, and you already know, how much the basic sustenance needs, then the people themselves can budget themselves, unless there's other factors like mental illness or something.
Yeah, I think that the problems we're trying to solve are hard problems.
Yeah.
So problems of, how to better our education system, how to make sure that people are getting the jobs that they need to get, how to make sure that people have adequate access to healthcare. And the easy one to solve is how to make sure people are putting food on the table, right?
Exactly.
So as you said, let's give people enough money to make sure that they're meeting those needs so we can solve these much more complicated problems, right? So folks in government aren't trying to figure out how you get food stamps to people and how to make sure that they're not misusing them. People know what they need, right?
Exactly.
So let's solve that issue so we systemic problems.
Right. It looks like businesses behind this as well. What are they doing?
There is a growing movement and growing interest in this conversation, but I think we have a long ways to go.
Yeah.
So, groups like mine, like Universal Income Project, we have been focusing on advocacy, on talking to people, helping them kind of understand what this policy looks like.
Yeah.
How do we talk about it? Why do we think this is an important policy?
Right.
As well as talking about the history of this program.
Right.
And then you have groups like Economic Security Project, who put on the cash conference that you mentioned, that are really focused on expanding the pool of people that are advocating for this. So they are funding a number of different initiatives. So for example, one of the things that they recently funded was a study by the Roosevelt Institute. So they are a think tank that focuses on economic policy. So what they did is say, what kind of impact would a basic income have on the economy?
Right.
And what they found was that they estimate that basic income would actually increase GDP by 8% over the next decade if this is a policy we were to implement. Yeah. So this is a policy with, really positive implications for economic growth.
Right. In Stockton, after the seed project, that's how long is that for? A year or something?
So they're looking to start it in August 2018, and I believe the project is going to go for a couple of years, though the details are at stocktondemonstration.org. So they have a website up with all the details.
Okay, all right. And then after that, what's going to happen next?
That's a great question. I think that if the project is successful, I think success looks like them being able to tell the stories of what these families are going through, right? Sort of what economic and financial insecurity looks like in a piece of America, and how cash support programs can change that story. And so I think, what comes next is really dependent on how Stockton goes, right?
Exactly, yeah.
On how these stories are being told, what these families are going through, and how people feel about that.
Right. Well, usually there's like a plan, a strategy as to how you're going to elevate the discussion, right? At the local level, obviously Stockton is a good model for that, and then a state level and at the federal level. So with states, you have Hawaii and you have Alaska, and then how do you fold that in so that at some point, there's enough of a mass level type of information that goes to the forefront and say, that hits the floor of Congress and say, it's time that there should be a discussion on basic income. Do you see that?
Yeah, I really think it's exactly as you said. There are going to be pilots and conversations and experiments on different levels, right? We'll see cities that are experimenting with different versions of basic income. We'll see states that are experimenting with different types of policy. And then I think culturally, we have to have a conversation about how we feel about ensuring that Americans have dignity and financial security.
Definitely.
And I think at that point, when we're starting to see interest and momentum grow, and every time I've talked to folks about basic income, it's a pretty surprising concept at first, right? But as you talk through it, most folks come to the conclusion that it makes a lot of sense.
Why not?
Right?
Yeah.
People know what they need, and this is a policy that makes it very simple to ensure they can meet their basic needs. So I think it's really about having a lot of different players at a lot of different levels come in.
Right.
And for Americans to really start thinking about this concept.
Well, it seems to me that, for instance, like in California, it almost looks like you need a champion or you need champions who would look at the various programs that the state has, that are income, generating, that are revenue generating, and influence the legislators to say, hey, carve in X amount from these different programs and develop a pool, for what would be then a basic income. That would be one thought on that.
Yeah, and dividend programs are actually very bipartisan supported programs.
Exactly, yeah.
Everyone loves dividend programs because it means that for Democrats, it means that poor folks and working folks get more money in their pocket, and Republicans love it because they feel like, look, this is money that's going back to Americans or going back to California taxpayers instead of going into the government. So I definitely think there's a huge opportunity for us to be having these conversations in California in 2018 with the gubernatorial election.
Exactly. Well, this is excellent. So
I think we'll also see a wave of people that are sort of running on this as part of their policy, which should be interesting. An idea.
Yeah. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, so thank you. We will continue this conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us, and good night.